As parents, we teach our children that if they're ever lost, if they're ever in trouble, the one stranger that they can go talk to is a police officer. They're here to help us, and they are our friend. And yet every day, children of disunited families see those same police officers being used as weapons of power and control by one parent against the other. When is it appropriate to involve the police in a family matter? And when isn't it? That's what we're talking about today on Fathers Are Parents Too. We're here today with Detective Diana Bishop of the Santa Clara Police Department in California. Detective Bishop, when you're involved in family matters that you're called out on, is there sort of a more common thread than not? What's the most typical sort of family call, aside from the issue of domestic violence, that you would get called out to?
A lot of the things that we would be called on are things that are right before a domestic violence situation would occur, where people feel the need to call the police to solve a problem that's really not a police problem, but is a problem that they don't know how to deal with any other way. And someone, be it the mother, the father, maybe a child living in the house, will call because they feel that there is a threat, a possible injury that might occur, and they call us to kind of calm down the situation before something does happen.
So the children actually are the ones calling now, and even in families where the parents are living apart. When does that most often occur in that situation then?
It quite often will occur when they do live together. The child will see the mom and dad getting to a point where they're concerned about their welfare, and they'll call 911, and it's really a sad thing when a child does have to do that because they feel so threatened in their own home.
Right, I can imagine that's got to be really tough. And then in the cases where the parents are not living together, is it also that sort of situation? Or I know we've talked earlier about sometimes those calls come when one parent is there, doesn't want to give the child up, or is trying to take the child, and is that pretty common also?
It does happen. That would be a situation when obviously one of the parents would be the caller rather than the child in most circumstances.
Okay, and then what's that call usually about? What does it involve?
Whether it be where there's an actual court order for custody, or if it hasn't got to that point yet, they're just in disagreement, and they're not going to be able to resolve their problem without some type of mediation, and so we're the ones that are called to try to sort things out and make sure that everything is done legally and correctly the way it has been set out to do.
Well, now, you mentioned that sometimes they call even where there's no court order, like maybe they've not been to court yet. How can you get involved then? I mean, aren't you there to enforce the law, but I'm assuming that if there's no order, there's nothing. I mean, what do you do in that situation?
That's a hard situation. It does happen quite often, though. The thing you would have to do is normally, unless there's some extenuating circumstances, the child will be left with the parent that has custody or physical custody with them at that time. Whereas if the mom or the dad went to the other's house and wanted to take the children and there was no formal custody ruling, we are not going to facilitate, unless there's some reason the child is in danger at the house that it's staying at. We're not going to facilitate the other parent taking the child at that point, usually, because we don't have no jurisdiction to do that.
So that would probably be an example then of a time when it's not really appropriate for them to be calling the police to get involved, but it sounds like you're saying that they do it because they don't really know, or they want someone to get involved.
People, when they don't know who to call or have no other options, they call 911, and if you looked at calls for service at a police department almost anywhere in the United States, less than 30% will be for actual criminal violations or law violations. People just reach out and they call us, and we handle things that have no criminal part involved at all, and that's fine. That's what we're there for. We try to help any way we can.
So that is inappropriate.
I think so.
Now, in the case where there is a court order, Then what? Let's say that you've got a situation where a parent's there to pick up a child who's been with the other parent, and they have an order saying they've got, reasonable visitation is a real common one, and then you show up, and she's there saying, well, I'm not letting the child go today, and he's saying, well, she has to, and I mean, the child's there watching this, and you show up, and take it from there.
That's a very hard situation. The orders that have worked with and have seen usually stipulate exact, mom will have Monday through Friday, and they're very specific as to the timing of the exchange of the children. And if it's a valid court order, then the officer, whoever responds to the scene, will go by what the judge has ruled, because that is what we're there for, to enforce that law, and the law was what the judge ordered. I haven't seen them be ambiguous where it says reasonable. It would be impossible to do that.
That's what I'm wondering. We've had attorneys on the show who've said, in fact, that it's very important to make sure there's specificity in the order. For that very reason, we've also had that same attorney say there are times when the orders are ambiguous, and he posited that's exactly the problem, what you just said. If it's ambiguous, what do you do? And what do you tell, or would you tell, I guess I'm asking you to sort of hypothesize because you said you haven't run into it, but what would you tell parents if you showed up and the order was unclear? I mean, if it says, for instance, every other weekend, and he says, well, this is my weekend, and she says next weekend's his weekend, and you're stuck in the middle there, what are you mandated to do?
In a situation like that, if you couldn't determine which weekend it was in that situation, we have a lot of discretion in some things that we do. We have to use our brain a lot rather than just, everything's not black and white. There's a lot of gray area that you have to be able to really...
Is that a joke? Black and white? Sorry, is it no pun intended? Or?
No,
okay.
Yeah, I meant, clear or unclear.
You show up in the black and white? Okay.
Yes, I see what you're saying.
Sorry.
Right over my head. Okay. You have to be able to do... You're not... In a situation like that, it would go back to what I said a little earlier, in that if it's unclear and you're not going to take the child from the parent that has physical custody at that point if it's so ambiguous that
right.
you don't know you're making a correct decision. You're not going to do that to a child or, the other parent, because it's not spelled out, clearly and concisely. And then you would obviously suggest to them that they contact their attorneys and say, we need to make this more clear so it can be worked out.
Now, in those situations, how do the parents respond to your... I mean, obviously, one of them has called you,
right.
and so they're probably glad to see you show up, and the other parent, I'm assuming, may not be, and yet it sounds like there's going to be times where the parent who called is not going to be pleased with the outcome. And what are the common things that you have to deal with in terms of once you're there, and they think, oh, the cavalry's shown up, and you're there saying, I don't really have the ability to help here, or yes, you should let the child go, and that's not what they wanted. What sort of responses are you dealing with in that situation?
In that type of situation, we would probably have two officers go to the call, because it could be a volatile situation because there's so many emotions involved.
Sure.
And we'd have each officer talk to each parent to tell them, explain what is happening and what the parameters of what we can do are and what we can't do. And quite often, you're right, it will be the person who called might not get what they wanted. He or she might think that they're right, and boy, this child is going with me, and you'll say, look, ma'am, look, sir, this is what it says, and this is what we have to do, and so there's going to be one person not pleased, obviously, but if you do it in a diplomatic way and in a professional way, if they're really responding logically, they'll see that you're doing what you have to do. Mm-hmm. And you're not going to be a popular person probably for the moment, but you have to do what you have to do.
Now, what do you see this doing to the children? Because when I opened the show, what was on my mind, as I said, was here are these kids, and they see one parent has called the police, and they know the police are the people that come and they take criminals away and they put the bad guys in jail, and they're the authority. And have you actually been in a situation where it was very obvious to you what the impact on the child was, be it good or bad? Just, that's got to be a really tough thing for a child to process.
Sure. They see, their parents upset, which obviously is upsetting to them to begin with, and then this officer, who is this authority figure, is coming to their house, and they think mommy or daddy, like you say, is going to go to jail. And so we have to lessen the impact of that by maybe talking to the child on their level, meaning, not this authority figure, but person to person, and try to explain to them what we're there for, and we're trying to help both mommy and daddy to do what's right for them, because they are the most important piece in that whole puzzle as far as I'm concerned.
Right. Let's talk. We have a couple of more minutes, and then we're going to take a break and go take some questions from the audience. But I know that your background is at least as much in responding to domestic calls where there's allegations of some sort of violence or abuse, and so I know that's a subject matter close to your heart. And a question I have for you is, I have actually run into a case where actually a couple of times I've heard this, where there was an abusive situation going on where actually either both of the parents were shoving each other, and it was sort of they were both being jerks, or where even the female was the one who was beating on the male, and the male was there trying very hard to not hit her because he knew if he did, boy, that would be it. Right. And where a neighbor had called the police, or even in the one case I'm thinking of, it was the father that called the police and said, please come help, and he ended up being the one taken away. And he was astonished, and he said, couldn't they see I had scratches on my face? She didn't have a mark on her. I never touched her. But she said I shoved her, and I was the one arrested. And I think there's a perception that that's more the case than not, and I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit.
Of the cases I see, which most of my cases are domestic violence cases, I would say 95% of the time, if there's an arrest, the male was arrested. And I'm sure that there are some situations where, I mean, it's been known to happen where the woman will set up the whole thing, put some injuries, because in this county, Santa Clara County, the law is very specific, and we have a domestic violence protocol for all of the agencies in the county that we are to adhere to, that all the chiefs agree to, and it basically says any sign of injury, the person shall be arrested. So if the person, woman or man, knows this law, they could, you see where I'm leaning, they could set up where he hit, there's no other witnesses, he hit me or he scratched me and I've got this scratch on my face, and we're mandated by law to take them to jail. If we don't, we are violating our policy and the...
And you could be held accountable.
Exactly, and you err on the side of caution in domestic violence situations. You're not going to solve their problem that night by being there by any means, but you are hopefully going to alleviate any more violence or injury that evening. And if one of the people goes to jail that night, well, it's not going to be, it's a Band-Aid on a huge problem, but it's going to solve the problem at that point.
In other words, what you're saying is whichever one is taken away, it's separating them, and that's part of your duty that you have to do is keep them apart.
And also sometimes, in rare circumstances, both will be arrested.
Really?
That happens quite often.
A surprise, you're going too.
You know, he hit me, she hit me, both have visible injuries. Unless you can really figure out who was the aggressor or who went over what the situation was calling for, which sounds awful in violence, you know, hit, 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 stab. Okay, well, the stab wins or loses, whichever way you want to look at it. But both of them will go unless you can really figure who was the aggressor. And then at some point the district attorney will figure out who, if anyone, gets charged. But at that night, those people are safe.
No, so what would you, you know, if I were sitting here as a man saying, I think this could happen to me, and when the police come, what measures can I take? If I know that I'm probably the one that's going to be taken away because I'm the man, and I yet know that I haven't done anything, what can I do to try and at least protect my rights or protect the record or whatever? You know, what should a man in that situation do to at least try and look down the road so that he'll eventually be cleared, so that the DA can look at this and say, well, obviously this guy didn't really do this, there was a problem, but he wasn't aggressing or whatever.
That's a very hard situation, because usually in these situations it's one person's word against another person's word, and if you have an injury, as I said, the person that's inflicted the injury is going to go to jail, and most of the time the man is the aggressor, and not 100% by any means. There are women out there that beat men all the time. I just mostly see, just from what I've noticed, it's mostly men that are the suspect, quote unquote.
Which makes sense with the law as you were describing it. I mean, it's much easier to believe that the scratch on her face came from him than...
I wish I had a great answer to tell you about what the man could do, and I would just have to say, boy, just
get out, it sounds like.
Get out, because you know, if it's going to affect you by having an arrest or losing your job or losing time at your job, and you know that she is capable of that, that might be a big warning sign. It's not worth it.
Yeah, that's tough. Okay, we're going to take a break, and then we're going to go take some questions from the audience.
Great.
Okay. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm a dad and a member of FREE, the Father's Rights and Equality Exchange. Most dads out there would love to spend more time with their kids and to become a really big part of their lives. FREE wants to change the notion that all divorced dads are irresponsible, because fact is, most of us are responsible, and we're just working for a chance to share in the parenting. If you'd like to learn more, please call us at 1-500-FOR-DADS or check our website at the number or the address on your screen. And remember that fathers are parents too. Right?
Right.
Yeah.
We're back. We're back with the studio audience, and we have some questions for Detective Bishop. Let's stand up, please.
Yep. So you talked about how important it is to have a custody order that's clear and unambiguous enough that you can interpret, you know, who should have custody of the kids at that particular time when you're called out in one of those sorts of matters. I wondered what you would do, or if you've had any experience in being called out on a matter like that where the custody order was clear, but for some reason, perhaps the children were teenagers, perhaps, and the children didn't want to comply with the order. And what would you do in that circumstance?
Wow, that's a
good
tough
question.
situation. I luckily have not had to deal with that myself. We're not going to drag children kicking and screaming away from one of the parents. That's not going to happen, whether the order says that or not. And that I'm speaking for myself on that one, and hopefully I'm speaking for most officers everywhere. That's the whole thing. I think revolves around the child and the child's welfare. And in that circumstance, the parents are going to have to, at a later time, reevaluate the order or talk to the children in a less volatile atmosphere and make things different in the order so the child's not that upset. But no dragging and screaming. That's not right.
That raises the question, have you ever run into the situation where you've been there when the parent used you or your power as a threat to the child? You know, if you don't do this, I'm going to have this police officer, whatever. I mean, has that happened?
That has happened, and even in situations where it's not an enforcement situation, as a joke, you'll be seen as a police officer in uniform, and mom or dad will say, now if you don't, you know, do what I say or be a good little boy or girl, I'm going to have the police officer take you to jail. I mean, they're joking, but that's not funny to me, and it surely is sending the wrong message to the child.
So what do you do? And have you ever been in a situation where you were able to say something to the parent?
I'll say, you know, I'm not here to take anyone to jail. I'm here to help out in whatever situation we're here, and I want to help you and your mom and dad. So I try to downplay the law enforcement side and upplay the I'm a person trying to help you side.
Well, you are actually also a peace officer, right? I mean, you're there to help maintain or facilitate peace?
That's a very good point. That people say law enforcement, which is very, hey, someone's going to jail, and peace officer is whatever it takes to maintain the peace. And that's the way I like to look at myself. Yes.
Okay. Yes.
I have a question about what it takes to have an order enforced. I had a friend whose ex-wife arbitrarily decided that he wasn't going to see the kids anymore. The court order said he was supposed to see the kids 3 weekends out of 4, and that was the way it was worded. He went to try and see them 4 weekends in a row, and each time she called the police, and the police sent him home, and he never got to see his kids. Is there any way he could have created a situation working with the police officers to say, look, I've been here this many times, obviously the order isn't being enforced. Yes, it's ambiguous because it doesn't say exactly which weekend I have them, but obviously something's missing here. Could he work with them without having to go and spend several $1,000s he didn't have on a lawyer and several months of legal effort?
In that situation, the person representing the father in this situation could very well be the district attorney's office, meaning after if the wife's calling, or he could go there, she's not giving me the kids, call up us and we will come out and we'll take a report, violation of a court order. I think.
I'd like to respond. He did. Every time he went up there to see those kids, he first went to a payphone near the home and called the police and asked if they would accompany him. And every time they said no. And they said, we will only respond if she calls the police. So he would go, and then she would call the police, and the police would send him away. And they had been warned. He said, I'm going to be there. You're going to get a call. Be ready for it.
Wow. Is that
And
in this area?
that was in Sacramento.
Okay. I don't condone that at all. That shouldn't happen. That hopefully doesn't happen frequently. That's very disappointing to hear that. All I can talk about is this county and specifically the city that I work in, and that would not happen. Whoever calls, we do civil standbys all the time where people just, I'm going over to her house, there's going to be a problem, please come with me and we'll go. I mean, that's fine. So that was wrong what happened to your friend, and hopefully with shows like this and more education, people will know what their rights are and be able to assert them. Yeah.
You mentioned civil standby, and actually I was going to ask you, because I've heard that term, is that an actual procedure that, is that the right term, and people can avail themselves of this and everywhere? Is that something the police are supposed to do?
As far as I know, everywhere it's a common term that we use for a variety of things, but it basically means someone's going somewhere where someone else is that they're probably not going to get along, and let's send a couple of officers to make sure that nothing happens to either one of them. So if a person calls, if specifically in Santa Clara, and says, I need a civil standby, we'll know what that term means, and I'm sure everywhere around here will know what those terms are. On that same vein, we've had custody issues where they needed a place to drop off the children that nothing was going to happen. And we've had visitation or drop-offs in the lobby of the police department.
Really?
Where, it's Sunday, it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the children are here, the mom's here, the dad comes and picks them up, because nothing's going to happen. That's hopefully a very safe environment. But I'm not advocating that everyone do that, of course, but I'm saying that is another way of feeling safe in what you're doing.
That's got to be so much fun for the kid. Oh, are we going to go tour the police department again?
Yeah, it's sad. I don't have children myself, but you can see the look in their eyes and think of yourself going through that, and it's heartbreaking quite often.
And that really brings us home to the point of the show, which is for people who are thinking of calling you or using your services to think about how it's going to impact their children, which is really what this is all about. So what would you advise people? You know, I opened the show with what's appropriate, what isn't. Can you sort of just off the top of your head sum up what you think is appropriate and what isn't in terms of use of the police?
Yes, this is all predicated on the person thinking logically, and oftentimes that's not going to be the case, but you have to say, okay, is this something that I'm not using the police as a tool to make the other spouse or ex-spouse look bad? Is this something that I need to do for my own protection or for the children's protection? If that is, always err on the side of caution and give us a call. That's fine. That's what we're here for, to help. But if you're doing it to, like you say, use the police as a pawn in your game of, emotional abuse on your ex-spouse and ruining your children's psyche as well, then you shouldn't call, but those people will probably call anyway, unfortunately. We'd rather you call, the bottom line.
I imagine that the people who fall into the latter category really aren't thinking about what it does to the child.
Not at all. They're just mostly concerned about themselves, I think.
Right, right. Sir, you had a question?
Yes. Are you? Is there a prosecution unit for domestic violence in Santa Clara County? The crux of my question is that several years ago, I believe the federal government passed a bill saying that they would give money to states, and states would then give money to counties if they set up some kind of vertical prosecution to get more domestic violence cases, and then they had to report statistics back to Sacramento, and for some time that was not funded. But there's been a tremendous number of increased arrest activity and prosecution in that area, and I wonder if the money ever started coming from Washington and if that contributes to the increased prosecutions.
Excuse me, the money aspect, I'm not really sure where the DA's domestic violence unit gets their funding. However, I do know that they do report all of their statistics to the state, to the Department of Justice for statistical purposes, and that might be for what you're talking about. The County of Santa Clara has the vertical prosecution, as you mentioned, of domestic violence, where there's a actual team of district attorneys with one team leader who that's all they deal with is domestic violence from start to finish, and they're very proactive and they're very aggressive, and I think they're very good. Of course, I don't have anything to compare them to, but I work with them often, and they're all people that really care about what they're doing. And this county, I think, is on the forefront of most counties in California of doing domestic violence the correct way. And as you know, it is in the news quite often now, and it's something that's in the public eye, and it needs to be addressed. It's always been there, but people are now willing and able to report things that they normally wouldn't have. So I think that's great.
And you mentioned when you say vertical prosecution, I'm still not clear.
What that usually entails is, in some cases where if not a domestic violence case or just some generic case at the DA's office, one DA will issue the case, meaning look at the report and say, oh, we have enough here to charge him or her with a crime, and they will get a criminal complaint against them. Well, when it goes to court for an arraignment, another DA will pick up the file that day and say, oh, okay, let me take care of this. And then if it goes to, a jury trial, another DA will get it, where there's no continuity into what their plan is, and different people are handling the same case, whereas in the domestic violence unit, they have misdemeanor deputy district attorneys and felony deputy district attorneys that handle those two types of cases all the way through the whole process. So they're more in tune with the case itself.
It seems to me that in theory then that would mean that someone who was being falsely accused would have a better shot at clearing themselves because they're dealing with the same person.
I think so, and I think so. And what has impressed me about the office is that any victim, suspect, witness, whoever can call directly to the DA that's handling their case, or the woman who issues the cases, and she'll answer the phone, she'll talk to you about your case, and I think the accessibility is really important, and it's there.
That sounds really good. Well,
Yeah.
Thank you. We've just run out of time, so thank you very much for joining us, and thank you, and be sure to join us next time on Fathers or Parents Too.